Hello everyone, today we talk about Bactria, Ferghana and Sogdiana, roughly around the Iron Age, as a video that is actually part of the Chinese warfare series that we started recently, Ancient Medieval Warfare, for which we will keep kind of in part at least a minimal Chinese perspective, as we will expand in fact towards both sides, right, of course, of the aisle. In this sense, and we will make actually very specific videos dedicated especially to Bactria, the Bactrian army in detail, its organization and tactics as for what the Hellenistic warfare series is concerned, and also about in general Ferghana, Sogdian, etc., and look also more in detail at certain particular events, such as for example the Battle of Sogdian in 38 BC, that some say being actually the only known clash, but it's debatable depending on the sources and times properly the version of the same, between Roman legionnaires and Chinese troops, right? This would have been some Crassus veterans that the Parthians had deported in Central Asia after Carrhae. And that's another thing. Today's video actually is just a very superficial overlook at these areas, their importance, and their warfare, very generally meant across mostly this time that, as you understand, is somewhat even boundless, but that we'll try to grasp through the general essence of these military cultures. And yeah, it's to be taken just as that, and then we will again talk hopefully in detail, much greater detail, for each of these areas. So we're looking first of all geographically at the map of today's essentially upper Xinjiang, right, in western China, the areas of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, right, and also eastern Kazakhstan, roughly. So we're looking also at north and west of the Tarim River basin as another point of reference. And such kingdoms were very important because they connected the west with the east, geographically and culturally, and therefore every time you want to study essentially Rome or China compared, we will do that at some point. This was a very important connection that, arguably being relatively far from both, from the core of both empires, but still contained a very important political, balance, especially as far as China was concerned. As far as an eminently continental power with no substantial boundaries between itself and these areas, would push more surgically, let's say, towards the west in this fashion, and trying to open these choke points of the Silk Road that were, after all, in spite of the difficulties that land routes entailed for the travelers, the most direct communication with the West, right? And it is important in here, of course, to look at the Bactrian and Sogdian people properly meant, because these were recorded by Chinese historians who were quite interested in these populations for this broader strategical reasons, and the movements of peoples. There were really many in here, right? And the Bactrians and the Sogdians apparently were, by being a mix, right, of different races, were prevalently, at least, more, markedly and evidently Iranians, Indo-Europeans proper. There are some unflattering, somewhat racialistic descriptions even of these peoples, but interestingly enough, the Bactrians and the Sogdians were recorded as having reddish hair and green eyes, except the chronicle goes on to say that they looked like kind of weird monkeys. They were somewhat dark still in a way, and this is how they address these peoples. And naturally there is some kind of ethnocentric bias and so on, but objectively these were barbarians, right, from the Chinese perspective. And surely these peoples were also mixed as early as that with the Turkic Mongol populations that they interacted with so much, and were eventually overrun at some point by historically and it's obvious at that point to draw a similarity between the Sogdians and the Bactrians and the Kushans and the Tokharians, right? That were quite likely connected by a common Aryan migration, right? You know that especially the Tokharians were a bit this exception because they are the easternmost of the Indo-European peoples, and they actually belong to the western branch. Seemingly, they weren't Iranians. They were very akin, as far as we understand. There are beautiful Tarim mummies that show, excellently preserved corpses. Literally, we have properly the hair colors, the clothes, all intact, and thanks to the dry environment that look oddly proto-Celtic, proto-Scandinavian, right? And maybe we're tricked by that in the sense that at the time, also Indo-European peoples were not. We don't know exactly when they migrated there, so the dating, etc. Some look at the clothing that's similar to certain patterns you can find in Celtic fashion, etc. But these peoples were essentially what the broader, the Indo-Europeans were at the origins, also in moments when they were not differentiated, they hadn't even split from the main core and so on. So it's a very interesting ethnic background there. Now, it's important not only for its strategic location between east and west, but also because of the production of ores and horses that these regions were relevant, as they also had some important wealth. They were, as we'll see now, we will mostly see them as nomads, but these Central Asian areas, especially the western and southern you went, they tended to to gradually turn into something more sedentary, right, and civilized, and therefore Greece, also in the case of Bactria, that is quite evident, right? It was conquered by Alexander, or it was already settled, but it was as a Achaemenid region was settled already by Greeks that the Persians had brought there, and that also favored the autonomism against the Alexandrine rulers, as the local Greeks didn't quite like the Macedonians. And there was, the local satraps managed to autonomize it, as you know, originally from the Seleucid rule, because they were factually just their subjects in the area. That show, indeed, that was the Alexandrian military tradition. I mean, of course, Western sedentary ones, the phalanx, etc. But when we look indeed at the pre-existing populations, and it's hard to do it because they're not very well documented areas, right? Notionally, we know about them just because at some point Alexander went there, some rulers followed him locally, and so on, that we more or less have some reference, but except from archaeology and some other iconographic sources, it's difficult for us to even properly know what the hell was going on there. And most of these peoples were and would remain, even after Alexander conquest, nomads, right? This, of course, the culture, the equestrian culture, and the important connections. So think about the Ferghana Valley and its horses, and we'll talk about them in the end. How important they were for warfare, right? For semi-nomadic people, but also for the Chinese, right? That literally at some point stormed the area and imported en masse these beautiful, beautiful breeds. They were effectively the best horses in the world, as far as the military employment was concerned, that were properly bred in that function. And it was some important wealth also locally, especially in Sogdian, etc., because of these raw metals, etc. Later, you see the Silk Route developed over time, right? Already at the time of Alexander, yes, there were some exchanges. That has always been the case. But when you talk about the Silk Route, it's mostly, starting at that time and increasing. So with the increase in traffic of the silk caravans, right? We properly talk of the Silk Route as such. And as a consequence, these areas also greatly advanced in importance. which is quite interesting because historically, again, they didn't have much of a local sedentary development, and this route, depending on these traffics, they depended, in a sense, on the broader events that were revolving around, in fact, the Eastern and Western empires, and as a consequence, floating there. As areas in Central Asia and towards Persia that would have this odd mix of sometimes, such of the largest cities in the world. For example, the ancient Antiochia in Marjana would be Merv, right, in the Middle Ages before the Mongol conquest, was the largest city in the world, right? And you think, but these places as like the middle of nowhere, and as a matter of fact, they weren't. They were quite densely populated at some point. It's just that the wealth of these cities was very, in fact, very commercially related. Of course, the city existed because there was a surrounding agricultural economy that could support them in the first place, in which they could extend their own control. But all around, it was still semi-nomadic tribes, and these, constant waves and of peoples that came to settle, and eventually were crushed by the older, some other warlike ones that came and literally one after the other, as a tide from the steppe, were of course also limiting the possibilities of these places to stabilize politically in a way. But paradoxically, and for everybody who also has studied, I don't know, medieval Islamic philosophy and science, it was some, the most brilliant minds that eventually would come to have a great success in the caliphate and the universal theories and so on, were actually coming from these areas, right? Mostly actually from Khorasan, not really quite these ones, which were a bit wilder. But still, there was a deep connection. And just think about technology. I mean, think about the Battle of Talas River, how the Arabs crushed the Chinese at some point, and in their easternmost journey. And it's said that paper came in, the Caliphate and eventually the Mediterranean in Europe through that battle, because the Arabs captured some, technicians, some Chinese who knew the secrets, say, of paper making and so on. So it was a great, it was a world that would bring even properly human mind to an extreme, considering the ferociously violent climate and weather and terrain and ground. I mean, some of the I think, most beautiful landscapes in the globe are from these areas, but properly, you had to have extremely tough people to inhabit them, and this was reflected in their military. The importance of levied on Sogdiana, Kangju, if I'm not wrong, or Sangju in Chinese, can be seen in regards also to this adventurer Chih-Chih that interfered in the narrative of the Battle of Sogdian. We will see at some point these were rulers that had been floating around at the westernmost ends of the Chinese Empire. At some point were called also by the Sogdians to settle and to extend some power across, in fact, the Chinese frontier, and kind of monopolizing these traffics and coming to be very powerful. And the Chinese actually realizing that that went at their detriment in some way, so organizing expedition to crush the centers of power. And you would imagine that this was also a world, we're talking about the 1st century BC, extremely primitive times, especially for these areas. And the Chinese Empire at that point would be aware, of course, of these things. They would send, in fact, missions, both diplomatic and military, in this case, real invasions. But the capacity of assessment sometimes was also, for such faraway places, spatially connected to the, Chinese administrators, agents that could take some initiative in exposing the imperial court what the interest in the area was. And it was quite complex. Around the Tarim Basin, there were, many different tribes, a bit like Game of Thrones kind of things, and they were dramatically unstable, right? Well, as always, these great sedentary empires had to cope with these Eurasian peoples that were perennially unstable. You wouldn't even quite understand in practically who they were, right? And we see it in the West, in the East. The same Parthian Empire had, in spite of it, and Sasanian Empire, in spite of the fact they came themselves from the steppes originally, this kind of problem of coping with always this, restless oceanic steppe, always full of warlike peoples that crash against one another, and would bounce against their own frontiers, and damaging in the process, and wanting to settle and permeate and so on. The Ferghanian horses were some of the most prized resources of the time on the market of war, and were sought after by all of these peoples. And they were arguably the main reason, at least in relative terms, for two Chinese campaigns under the Han Dynasty, both which were successful, by the way, both in 102 BC and 103 AD, 200 years of distance, showing, the Han military, we'll see it in detail, but was quite advanced, and, the need for a heavy shock cavalry, and the result, the problem of the stirrup, etc. Interpretation is quite a thing, and considered even in comparison to the Western timeline, how advanced Chinese military culture was at that point. And it was relatively easy in the sense that at least these expeditions would test dramatically Chinese army, and mostly because of the environment which they came operate. But after all, they would have to fight against small kingdoms, and these expeditions were successful, so that the Chinese drew many horses from those lands to stock their own stables. We'll talk about the Ferghana horse in a while, properly in its characteristics. And over time, however, with the contraction of the Chinese Empire, similar to the collapse of the Roman one, in a way, these areas would be taken over by the Xiongnu, by the Blue Turks, and other nomadic tribes of different ethnicity from the Iranian one. It still was quite strong, actually, in those areas, and would remain, because at the end of the day, they would just blend within each other, and so some areas remained also more sheltered, etc. We find even in art the Tokharians maintaining up to first centuries AD and beyond, even the 6th, the full migration era, this strong ethnic character and appearance and identity, and they thought of them. And these areas remained, however, always particularly important for horse breeding, also for the new conquerors that kept that tradition alive, and in this sense, mastering that kind of horsemanship that was the pride of those lands. The heavenly horses of the Ferghana Valley, so how they were called here, by the same Chinese, and the religion of these cultures revolved, as a matter of fact, not differently actually from even the European one, around the horse. Right? We have been fed this lie that the Western Indo-Europeans, by settling in Europe, becoming prevalently, in fact, sedentary and having mostly infantry-based armies, right, with fewer cavalry, differently from the semi-nomads, would be kind of secularized, democratic, infantry-based populations. None more wrong than this. The horse was central to every single European mythology, properly in the ultra aristocratic nature that these populations carry in a religious military sense, right? And the horse is everywhere, and it was attributed an enormous moral and military superiority, properly in the figure of the knight in every single culture in Europe and in Mediterranean. So much that there are so many anecdotes. I mean, even the same Augustus, at some point, while he managed to subdue, to bring to an agreement the Parthians, etc., was given and even taking over some Hellenistic capitals, he was very interested in the Ferghana horses and wanted to see them, to bring them to Rome. There is all there an important religious military connection with Roman culture and those ancestral equestrian symbology. And so speaking of the Central Asian armies in this sense, more or less in these regions, we will brutally simplify in this, and in general we see semi-nomadic cultures, right? We can appreciate the value of some infantries, mostly light ones, as you understand, and especially in these broken terrains, which are quite heavily mountainous in some areas and so on. You would have very flexible, very fast-moving and capable and tough mountaineers and so on. Seemingly not much of a deeper, military organization in the idea of, solid lines of stopping infantry, etc. This is something you do find here and there in the same places, right? But not maybe to the extent of, of even properly the open steppe, right? The reasons we will comment, we will talk in detail about Saka military organization and Bactrian military organization. The centrality of the horse among these populations seem to have those be a trademark of that Aryan way of war, right? The early Bactrians having essentially Scythian ancestors, and this being true for basically everybody, for the Medians, essentially the Achaemenids, later the Parthians, etc. And so cavalry, and originally, still in the, in some centuries before Christ, war chariotry being used to a maximum. These were some of the areas where chariot warfare had developed the earliest, right? Eventually, of course, cavalry would broadly speaking take over, but still, it would have not been so strange, even in the symbology of these peoples, and sometimes even for a ritual, for parades, for other events like that. The chariot was still an enormous symbol of kingship, of universal cosmic military power that would be paraded, that would remain in many of these peoples also later on in history, a trademark of that ancient superiority. Camelry was very important as well, the Bactrian camel, due to the traumatic weather that you can find in those places, and considering that, as you know, these peoples think about the Greco-Bactrian and the Greco-Scythian kingdoms that came to rule even over parts of India, so necessarily passing through Kushan to some of the mountain ranges there are really impervious, etc., needed camelry of that kind, the Bactrian camel. These camels would be sold, in fact, by any people who eventually would venture there. The same Arabs at the time of the conquest would do the same. These were very tough breeds that could go on and on, with a great physical resistance and capacity of living out of their own fat. Fundamentally, that is also what their humps fundamentally are about. Across this extremely tough weather, that literally, if there are some expeditions here, you had to be lucky. In order to pass certain ridges, even in summer, you could find a frozen weather at some point. Half of your army could be wiped out, right? So it was always a gamble, but you needed to be best equipped with that. And so the camel breeds were also quite important, and they would spread actually also around, not differently from the Ferghana horses in the same ways, were sought after commercially. Even the camelry had a military role, right? There were cameled troops, let's say, throughout this all this area as a common thing, and Alexandrian Hellenistic military influence did show up in, for example, the Bactrian reliefs at Persepolis. But when we look in general at local warfare in Central Asia, we realized that Western warfare was just very superficially there, right? That it also kind of evaporated after some time. You know, the Alexandrian tradition didn't have any further range action over the centuries, so that you could visit Bactria after centuries and not really finding much left of that. And also, of course, because the world was extremely different from a political and social point of view, so the military organization would reflect this. But we will see it better in videos dedicated to that. Speaking also of the early Middle Ages, considered that it was a very powerful range action of some properly equestrian, hardcore equestrian culture, also the Turkic waves, and this, if you want, feudalization of the area compared to the early tribes, right? That had brought some important changes, probably in a broader decline, reflected by a broader decline of infantry toward that time, for the few that had existed already at that point in the Indo-European one. And most of the local armies had a decimal system of organization. It would be, in fact, universal in the steppe at that point, and also these peoples wouldn't make an exception. The horse archer was thus the main element of each of these kingdoms' armies, numerically speaking. And this would blend in historically also with the well-trained and mobile Hunnic model. The Scythians developed notoriously a tactic of firing volley after volley of arrows into the enemy, feigning defeat, goading him into a rash pursuit, only to be smashed by a fresh reserve. There was an important element of heavy cavalry as well, the nobility always representing that in a way, but numerically this was quite restricted. In any case, it was enough, right? The material wealth was not enormous, but still, as we've seen, especially the Bactrian, the Sogdians, had accumulated an important wealth over time. So we see very interesting developments in armor. This evolved fast, especially in the first centuries before Christ, and it was in part based also on the blending of different cultures. The cataphract does come from the steppe, but was adopted functionally also by the Hellenistic armies, as you know, at some point. The Bactrians being some of the heaviest cavalry that you can imagine historically, because you know that the cataphract, properly meant, would decline actually in the first centuries after Christ, right? The same, even the most advanced sedentary populations could kind of engineer heavier cavalry in that sense, such as like the Sasanians were quite close to these Central European contexts, actually decided to lighten everything up, not just because they were a real cataphract was something enormously costly. I'm talking about properly the one that had a completely not just armored, not just horsemen, but especially a horse. Well, this would be instead the place where in the first centuries before Christ, you could see as also in important numbers, and especially considering the local wealth availability in parts. So there are extremely interesting military changes that today we can't talk about. We will talk about in extreme detail because there are beautiful studies on this. At some point, we never made a video actually about this, if not about the Seleucid cataphract, and that's all a different story because they were somewhat short-lived experiment, and also a quite late one occurring by actually this Seleucid Anabasis of Antiochus the Third, the Great, in the easternmost provinces of the Seleucid Empire, not quite even as far as these ones, where locally this tradition was otherwise a normality by that point. But in all this, still the overwhelming majority of horsemen were extremely poorly equipped, right? Poorly in the sense, in the material sense, not that it wouldn't be effective for what their tactical role was concerned. As a matter of fact, was some of the finest horsemen in the world, right? And the older Scythian tactics were pretty much standard and would continue over the centuries. So if we were to approximate at some point what were the proportions maybe of I don't know, unarmored horse archers, cameleers, charioteers, let's say the idea is that in Bactria and Sogdiana, chariotry was more there. For the simple reason, not that they had lagged behind, militarily speaking, but because it was a weapon used in anti-infantry function, which is essentially also how the chariot warfare had survived in the last centuries of the first millennium BC in the Mediterranean, even in places closest there to like the Seleucid Empire and so on. Because the chariot at that point would have been useless against other cavalry, but it had shrunk in numbers and increased in size, so to be used against infantry. So in these more sedentary areas like Bactria and Sogdian, in fact, you would have a minimal, I don't know, small percentage of charioteers, and then mostly, some heavier cavalry of some proportion, and the overwhelming majority of light cavalry. Ferghana armies, as far as I know, at this point might have properly not even witnessed chariot warfare properly anymore, being much more nomadic in nature, and wilder, broadly speaking. So there would be a typically old mounted army of some sort. Of course, they had some infantry as well, but we can't at that point even properly measure who was like just a dismounted horseman or not, right? So speaking of some evidence that we have of these types of troops, we have a Bactrian tribute bearer sent to Persepolis, famously immortalized at the audience hall of Darius. It's a pretty typical, let's say, Scythian look. Right, you know that in this iconographic source things are pretty stilized, and there are some and standardized by a certain degree, so that especially all these Central Asian peoples, so but actually they didn't look very different from each other, but maybe they're represented by the Persians in kind of a homologated way, let's say. They had costumes that were very well suited for the weather, albeit relatively poor, cheap. Long coats, right boots, also headbands or fillet as a head covering, and a very few had changed from Scythian times, right? And we don't see much of an Hellenistic influence in these customs either, right? The Scythian caps that you can find broadly across the Eurasian steppes, with some, connections even up to, the Pannonian Plain, right? The Dacians sometimes wore the same kind of caps, what you call the Phrygian caps, as a matter of fact, but reflecting this broader Pontic tradition, at least as far as the closest geographical areas in contact with these people was. The bow was the primary weapon, right? The great emphasis placed on them. Swords were, however, there. Could be highly decorated, serving as close-range protection, and the swords was, you see, among the steppe peoples, all like there is a ridiculous amount of surplus, and that's also part of the reason why warfare is there endemically, because there is no other way to become rich in a convenient way but pillaging your neighbor. So these peoples were also semi-nomadic, or fully nomadic, depending what's the standard you adopt there, and consequently they moved with all their goods. And a safe way at the end of the day of protecting your wealth could literally be wearing it all the time. And the sword among these people was, generally speaking, properly the indicator, sometimes with very, very specific and detailed and even extremely meticulous one, that features that could easily just visually make somebody recognize in terms of what tribe they were from, what were their social status, and generally speaking, it was obvious because a way of dispensing, the loot was the one of and showing wealth as a consequence was the one of gathering more retinues and being more powerful. So there was no such thing like much of the treasuring in the process, and ostentating this wealth was also a way just to show others how powerful you factually were, because trying to hide it for whatever reason you would have wanted to do in that place was stupid, because it would have given automatically less power in a situation where you were constantly threatened to be wiped out from a moment to another. And the Ferghanian and Sogdian cavalrymen would be pretty much similar to the Bactrian ones. There is some Chinese evidence from the Inan funerary relief in the Shantung province that is in the typical Xiaotang Shan style, dating to the later Han Dynasty. Pretty simple picture after all, and it shows properly some warriors and then some slaves, as with some prisoners, some captives. Colors are unknown. We may think that in these places earth colors would be, the natural ones used without needing to color that much, just maybe probably the rich could afford such dyes, etc. But we don't have to underestimate how important, in fact, even the visual aspect was. So maybe some feature in order to the distinguishing identifying feature, which tribe, whatever. We can't reconstruct that, unfortunately, but we know quite easily it would be there. And these guys, as they would be equipped, were, some horsemen. But this time the stirrup was there, by the way, with, a small round shield, a spear, and a bow, right? This is typical equipment, but also with some side weapon of sword, a blade. And that's basically the step standard that you can imagine, right? And that it was expected. As you understand, there is also some tactical flexibility in that you can go in the melee as much as being a missile trooper, the latter function being, however, prevalent, right? So that basically everybody knew how to use a bow and also other weapons, but the proclivity to use the latter in hand-to-hand combat seemed useless in certain contexts, at least in the ones where you could face, in fact, better equipped opponents, better armored opponents, and you would have just a bow, and so you wouldn't close in because it wouldn't be particularly advantageous for you. But of course these men were habituated, as you can imagine, to regular violence in the form of raiding, warfare, to see, to suffer, to enact themselves, and so surely they knew how to kill somebody without too much trouble. Somebody like that too, because most of the people they would find were, after all, more or less equipped in their own same way, in spite of this segmentations that of course existed, and especially numerically the majority of people were pretty similar, aside from the elite. Could be something more articulate. Speaking of the Ferghana horse that we were mentioning before, there's a beautiful picture that inserted also here from very famous at least in the Chinese art of the Tang Dynasty master Han Can, that shows properly the features of these horses who were dramatically beefy, were great at oxygenating for smashing charges, of course, and in this also difficult weather, also high altitude at some point, or at least somewhere where they had to make a considerable effort. It's no surprise that shock tactics and even cataphract horses and the stirrup were born here, because these breeds were the best you could find in the world, just to smash into somebody and turning it into a pulp. And these, of course, were extremely prized beasts, and the nobility were all about them. Of course, the rest of the people had runners or something else. But even those other races, those other breeds were good in their own respective function. So as we were saying before, in the up to as late as the early 2nd century BC, the Han Chinese waged an entire campaign just to subdue the Ferghana and Sogdian in order to acquire enough of these horses. And they were actually just a bit taller than the typical steppe pony. It's not much about how large you are, but how tough you are, right? And so the brutally rigorous steppe life needed such equally tough animals. And even the peoples, of course, that inhabited in better environments sought them. As at that point they could engineer, like the Chinese did, after all, that same kind of heavy cavalry that they would use in their combined arms system and their quite advanced military. So there was a legend about the blood-sweating horse in Eastern tales, and this is not a legend, not a myth actually, because there is a parasite infecting these animals sometimes, for which the capillaries on the skin surface of the horse are actually forced to bleed when the body is under stress. So you would have literally this thing emanating blood. It was seen in a much more symbolic fashion, properly, exploding with life, with this force and blood, and all the meaning, the connection was there. And naturally there were many sub-breeds as well, because as you can imagine, these people also lived part exporting them, and kind of that was a market that differentiated the various breeds, and whoever could manage to have some, and maybe they needed more horses and they just had one of these stallions maybe, and lots of other mares that were not about the same race, but so you would have quite mixed stuff. But basically any people in the surroundings, in the thousands of kilometers, would use these animals in a way or another as soon as they could get their hands on them, because they were fantastic and properly. There was all a mythology behind them, right? It was not just about the actual physical and also mental performance, because it's not just that horses are very intelligent animals, but these ones were properly created to be aggressive and violent. Like this, horses in general, war horses punch, kick, bite. They literally do it at one another, at humans, right? They're aggressive, like extremely strong beasts, by the way. So you can imagine what these ones could do in the first place, and they were trained to literally, at a single gesture, a minimal movement of the horsemen to move, take directions, because they were the mount of the ultra world horse elite. So the best equestrian warfare required animals you could trust as yourself, or even more, right? And there is no such thing like a good cavalry if the horseman is bad and the horse is good, or if the horseman is good and the horse is bad. You have to have, at least they have to go in tandem as a single one. And in fact, this war together with the horse, etc., was all part of the mythology of these people, the celestial, the hero, right, the military hero, and his celestial ascension next to the gods, etc. What was all connected to these horses as a medium to afterlife, coming from the earth, yes, as a fiercely chthonic animal in that sense, and the blood pouring out, and so all these things, but also running in these spaces, in these heavenly prairies and valleys, and making the horsemen ascending to the clouds, right, in this terrifying and beautiful landscapes. So, yeah, and the Ferghana horses were predominantly, as we can see, yellow, brown in color, also with black or darker hair on the legs up to the knee or mid forearm, right? And there were also grays as the most common color as well, and others. That, yeah, this was pretty much the broader vision. All right, so I hope this video is, it's not too rarefied, let's say, in information, but as I was saying in the very beginning, this is just a minimal introduction, or even properly thinking on these places in their military culture, what they were mostly about, and we will look at them in thorough detail, hopefully time allowing, in other videos. For now, however, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.